Welcome to The World Today. I'm Waqas Majeed Khan. Today we're talking about Khwaja Asif's visit to China, where it was a tripartite meeting being held between the Afghan foreign minister, the Chinese foreign minister, and of course Mr. Khwaja Asif, deciding about Afghanistan's future and what can be done, what initiatives can be taken in order to improve the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan. As we all know, peace in Afghanistan is very important for peace in not only Pakistan but the entire region. That will be our first topic. Our second topic is going to be talking about the so-called restrictions that were applied on Yadav's family when they came to visit him in Pakistan. We'll talk about the aspects of that particular meeting and how the Indian media is blowing it completely out of proportion. So we'll discuss that as well. And finally, we will also pay homage to our dear departed iconic, dynamic leader, Benazir Bhutto, who left us on this day 10 years ago. Let's get the conversation started. I'd like to introduce my guests in the studio. Joining me today, we have Ikram Ullah Bhatti Saab, and along with him, we have Khurram Iqbal. Thank you very much, sir, for being here. Sir, beginning our conversation, what do you expect? Because we've had a number of meetings, and a similar one, a tripartite meeting, was held earlier as well with China and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Again, we saw that meeting kind of stall. Even though the Americans were invited to attend it, they were absent. Now, do you think that this particular initiative, is it going to lead towards some tangible results, or are we still hoping and praying that it may lead to something productive and fruitful?
You see, we have had a long drawn spell of almost hostile relations with Afghanistan. And while we have been talking about it, we've been making efforts to mend fences and to improve our relations. But unfortunately, we have not been able to have any significant breakthrough. But when we look at our recent past, we see that there was a visit by the army chief in October, followed by a meeting in Baku between the leaders of the two countries, where the understanding in the army chief's visit was further taken forward. The greater understanding was made, and now we have seen that we have had a serious meeting in China, and after which it appears that the Afghan side has now expressed a serious intent to mend fences, to improve relations, and to move forward. So I think we can be hopeful. But the unfortunate part is that Pakistan and Afghanistan are two Muslim neighborly countries, and it's unfortunate that our bilateral concerns or issues are being handled by or assisted by a third party, with China. Though it's a common friend and a very close friend of Pakistan for quite some time now, and it has been essentially because of their effort that these relations are hopefully on a right path, and hopefully we should look forward to an improvement in near future. But the fact remains that though being immediate neighbors, having long historical ties, cultural ties, we are depending upon a third party to put us together on one table.
That in itself speaks volumes, doesn't it, sir?
Certainly, it does. But anyway, we were on a table and we have expressed our intention to improve our relations, which is, I think,
and we've been doing that repeatedly, sir. We've been voicing our concerns and also sharing our intentions with the Afghans for the past, I think, almost 8 or 9 years, as far as I've been talking about it for the past 5 years on this very forum, but it doesn't seem to be moving in any positive direction, sir.
You see, the fact remains that the current dispensation of the government in Afghanistan is not fully representative of the entire spectrum of population. A significantly large portion is disenfranchised, the Pashtuns, who are practically represented by Taliban. And while the Taliban do control around half or maybe a little over half the country, the current government is very heavily dependent, if not totally dependent, on the American assistance. who are essentially occupiers, an occupation force over there. So while we may not be willing to wholly look at them as the representative of the country, but the fact remains that they are there as a government, they're as a result of an election over there. So as long as there is apprehension, there are concern, there is reservation in the mind of the current government that we are still putting our weight behind the Taliban and not looking at the current Afghan government directly. So they'll be apprehensive, they'll be concerned, and they'll not be fully forthcoming to address the issues with us. So I think we'll have to come up with some diplomatic finesse so that while we keep the Taliban door open, we should be able to address the concern of the current government, and we should not put all our eggs in one basket, that is the Taliban, and we must
But sir,
be cognizant of this reality.
The government has categorically denied the presence of any support or safe havens that have been that Pakistan is constantly being accused of by the Afghans and the Americans. Khurram, what's your opinion on this matter? I mean, how can we go past this rhetoric and this constant blame game and using Pakistan as a scapegoat for American failures in Afghanistan?
Well, as far as the safe havens of Afghan Taliban in Pakistan are concerned, this is not mainly because of Pakistan's complacency or Pakistan's consent. It's mainly due to the porous nature of the border that we share with Afghanistan. Pakistan is very serious in eradicating that unchecked movement of criminals and terrorists, and we have demonstrated that since last 16 years. When Americans came to Afghanistan, Pakistan proposed, when President Musharraf was at the helm of affairs, that let us fence the border so we can manage and we can check the cross-border movement on the both sides. At that time, Americans refused, and even Hamid Karzai, who was the president of Afghanistan at that time, he invoked human rights issue. He invoked the tribal issues, that there are tribes distributed on the both sides of border and we may end up violating their human rights. As a matter of fact, when you're dealing with a hardcore national security issue, you have to at some point compromise on such issues. So Pakistan proposed that. That proposal was rejected by the Americans, but now Pakistan has put in a lot of effort to manage that border with Afghanistan. We have been able to fence almost 160 kilometers of the border with Afghanistan. Number of border enter and exit points have been modernized there. I think it will help to manage the movement. As far as Afghan Taliban's cross-border sanctuaries are concerned, I think now Americans must look for them either in Iran or perhaps in Qatar, because Iran has recently co-opted Afghan Taliban. Why? Because Iran perceives that there is a bigger threat which is in the making in the region, which is Daesh. Daesh is something which is threatening the internal security of Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan. So Afghan Taliban are now being seen as a formidable and effective counterweight or counterforce to the emerging threat of Daesh. So this is the regional consensus in South and Central Asia, and I think if Americans are sincere in eradicating the threat of Daesh, that's where our interests can converge with the West, that instead of going against Afghan Taliban using excessive force, we must engage them, we must bring them on the table so we may be able to deal with the threat of Daesh.
Well, that's a big if. But Khurram, let's also talk about the initiative by Chinese President Xi Jinping, because this particular tripartite meeting is Mr. Xi Jinping's initiative, and he wants to strengthen relations and develop cooperation between the three countries, which is China, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Do you think that the Afghans would be taking the Chinese president's wishes into account seriously and then trying to engage with Pakistan in a constructive manner, or is it just going to be the same old rhetoric that we've been used to now?
Well, China has a major stake in Afghanistan. There are two reasons that China is concerned about instability in Afghanistan. Number one, that instability can spill over into Xinjiang province, which is one of the unstable parts of China. Number two, China sees Afghanistan as the second most important node of Belt and Road initiatives. Chinese policymakers are of the view that the first important node of Belt and Road initiative is Middle East. There were attempts by the Westerners to destabilize the Middle Eastern region, but thanks to the timely and effective action by the Russians and their allies, Middle East is comparatively stable as Daesh has suffered major defeat there. Now, there are efforts to perhaps cultivate Daesh in the region. According to Russian intelligence sources, approximately 10,000 Daesh fighters have moved to Afghanistan. If that number is correct, we must be prepared to face a big threat. So to basically preempt that threat which is in the making, China wishes Afghanistan and Pakistan to sit on the table and deal with the issue of violent extremism, which does not only threaten the stability in Afghanistan, but Pakistan as well as China.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. But do you think that the Taliban are strong enough and willing enough to take on this threat in the form of Daesh? And then again, we also have major questions being raised when we talk about the American war on terror. Then we also have reports in the media appearing from time to time that the Americans are supporting ISIS and Daesh in various countries, and they're actually a tool that the Americans use for their nefarious foreign policy designs.
Well, two aspects of your question, whether Afghan Taliban are capable enough to fight against Daesh, I think they have proved that. When Daesh came to Afghanistan in 2014, Afghan Taliban formed an elite squad to fight against Daesh, and they have fought against Daesh very effectively, pushing them out of their strongholds in Nuristan province. Secondly, whether Americans are supporting Daesh and its rise in this
because
region.
Mr. Hamid Karzai has also voiced this opinion.
Not just Hamid Karzai. I think there's an element of truth to that, because when there were some decisive battles going on in Raqqa, Middle East, in Iraq, which was the stronghold of Daesh, according to the reports published in BBC, Americans facilitated the safe exit of more than 4,000 fighters of Daesh, and they basically allowed them to leave the area with trucks loaded with weapons. And as per the Turkish intelligence sources, those 4,000 fighters have used Turkey as a transit point to basically get into Europe, and some of those European fighters have also ended up in Afghanistan. So if there's a big if, whether United States of America is actually serious in fighting Daesh, but because if they were serious in fighting Daesh, they should not have allowed 4,000 fighters to leave Raqqa and basically go to Europe or Afghanistan.
A very tragic situation arising here. Let's talk about the peace process. AVM Saab, in your opinion, what practical action can we take in order to further the peace process in Afghanistan? When we talk about half the population of Afghanistan being disenfranchised because they are Pashtun and are from the Taliban stronghold, then what chances for peace do we see taking place in the near future?
You see, we must look at the objectives of the stakeholders before we can look forward to or hope for peace in the area. See, we just talked of Daesh taking root in Afghanistan. Now, when you look at Taliban, their designs, their objectives, their purpose is limited to liberating their country from the American control only. They do not have any ambition beyond the borders of Afghanistan, which this is their stated objective, stated goal. Whereas Daesh not only has regional, they have global designs, global ambitions. And while there are BBC reports or even Turkish intelligence reports, the Russians have also claimed and accused the Americans of relocating Daesh in Afghanistan. There have been reports of unmarked helicopters transporting these people from one place to the other and helping them, assisting them in settling down.
And also the weapons that they're using are American made.
Yes. So why would the Americans want to do that? If we want to believe the Russian or the BBC or the Turkish sources that this is happening at the behest of America or through American systems, then why would they want to do that? They would like to keep Afghanistan, restless, in turmoil, so that they can justify their presence over there. So that negates the entire peace process. So that means we should not hope for peace, because right now at the same time, in parallel, we find that all those forces which are against peace are being relocated, being strengthened by the Americans. If that be so, that means the Americans are not serious in bringing about peace in Afghanistan. And we should hope that the Afghanis should be able to see through this. They are in a state of turmoil, in a state of unrest since 1979. And they should be quite fed up of this. And I'm sure they would want to live in peace and help and see their country prosper, and their children develop and grow in a peaceful environment. So primarily it all rests with the Afghani people. But unfortunately we find that they are terribly polarized, absolutely disunited in different factions. The major one, of two sides, the government and the Taliban. And the government is quite happy and quite cozy with the American assistance. It's a war economy and they're living happily. And Taliban, of course, continue to fight. And the Americans have Pakistan as a scapegoat to continue to blame for their failures in not bringing about peace in Afghanistan, which they themselves do not want. So unfortunately, at the moment, we find that there are very little prospects of peace, unless the Afghani people themselves become serious, and the two parties, the Afghan government and the Taliban, become serious.
How important do you think, sir, is the OBOR and CPEC to the overall American policy for the region, especially when you see the unrest in Afghanistan? Do you think, and bringing Daesh into the picture as well, do you think it's really geared and focused towards disrupting OBOR and CPEC?
You see, there has been a statement by the American about the CPEC going through a disputed territory, which
also they said that there are many roads and many.
Of course, that is
ways.
trying to belittle the entire project, but at the same time, they've expressed their views also by saying that it's in a disputed territory. But the fact remains that the Americans are worried about the rising power of China. And they also see that this one road, one belt project and the CPEC part of it especially is going to further assist China in its rise. So in order to dismantle that, disrupt that, they would like to oppose it and of course see that it doesn't happen and doesn't see the light of the day. And that is why they would want that Afghanistan for this reason also, that it does not become peaceful. Because while CPEC is going through Pakistan, but if the Afghans also join in, of course, it will encourage them to become to accept peace, to settle down, and to enjoy the fruits of prosperity and well-being for the people. But that is what is not the American objective. So I guess they will continue to object. They will continue to disrupt this project through whatever means that they're available in their hands, and by criticizing it, by maligning it, by putting objections to it. But as we see, the Chinese have put in a lot of investment in it, and it is in their serious interest that this project materializes. And the Russians have also indicated that they'd like to be part of it. And several other regional countries, even Iran has indicated. And we hope and expect that one day India will also realize that it is to their benefit as well.
I'm glad you brought in India, sir. I want to bring this question to Khurram. Khurram, if you look at the Indian role within the regional dynamics of what is happening in Afghanistan, and especially when we look at the Chabahar port being used for trade between India and Afghanistan, why is it that the Pakistanis feel themselves isolated and left out from the entire equation and are, in a way bypassed and are actually made into not just a scapegoat by the Americans, but also by the Indians? And the Afghans also have a massive trust deficit when it comes to dealing with Pakistan. Is there some way we can overcome that? Do you think this meeting with Khwaja Asif and the Chinese foreign minister may have helped in ironing out those differences, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
Pakistan is certainly not isolated when it comes to regional security and foreign policy calculus. One Belt, One Road is a major factor that is contributing to transform the world from a unipolar order to a multipolar or bipolar order. There are ones who are satisfied with the existing status quo, led by the hegemon United States of America, and of course India is a part of that. And then there are dissatisfied powers, including Russia, China, Pakistan, Turkey, and Iran. So now the dissatisfied powers are trying to evolve a world order which is fair, which is just, because the previous world order that emerged after the Second World War, or let's say after the end of Cold War, benefited few at the cost of so many. And we were at the receiving end of that world order led by United States of America. So Belt and Road Initiative is very important to bring about bipolarity or multipolarity. America certainly sees BRI as a threat or as a tool of Chinese global expansion. And to respond to this Chinese economic expansion, Americans are opting for low-cost, high-impact interventions. Just because they're a hegemon, they cannot openly denounce this mega developmental project. So what they have done, they have resorted to support their proxies in form of state or non-state actors, and to basically challenge China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a part of BRI, they have increasingly relied on India. So now what India is doing, again, a low-cost, high-impact intervention. First, they said that we will go and we will counter One Belt, One Road through Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Then they announced that we will counter Belt and Road Initiative through reviving the spice route. So there have been a lot of proposals by India, but they have been very shallow. They have been very rhetorical, and there is very little substance to that. Why? Because India does not have the economic or financial muscle to support those initiatives, whereas China is basically loaded with trillions of dollars of surplus, possessing the economic surplus to go for such an ambitious project. So when India is struggling with its financial issue, no doubt, its economy has done well, but compared to China, they stand nowhere. So what India is doing at the moment, they have resorted to support proxy groups inside Pakistan to target China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and Kulbushan Yadav being the face of Indian terrorism inside Pakistan. Now, there comes the important point. Why United States of America does not pay any attention when Pakistan raises the issue of Indian-sponsored terrorism in Pakistan? That also speaks volumes about American approach towards terrorism. I think Americans themselves have this segregation of good terrorists and bad terrorists. They're only concerned about the terrorists who are targeting the American forces in Afghanistan, and they're least bothered about the terrorists targeting Pakistan, targeting China, or other countries. You have another example of Narendra Modi. He himself is a lifelong member of a terrorist organization which was banned in India on 3 occasions, which is involved in the assassination of the founder of India.
It was
the same person. He was a persona non grata in India, and then Americans
refused him the visa.
Refused him a visa, but
Yeah.
today he's the most sought after man in the United States of America. So America has a lot of double standards when it comes to dealing with violent extremism. If they are actually serious to eliminate terrorism from this region, they have to take Pakistan's concerns seriously.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad that you brought up Mr. Jadhav, because now we'll move on to his issue. The Indian media is up in a tizzy right now, sir. They have lots of accusations. 4 points, they say, that were violated by Pakistan. First of all, their religious sentiments were not respected by Pakistanis. That's one of the claims that they're making. They're also saying that the shoes of the lady in question, that is Mr. Yadav's wife, were confiscated by the Pakistani authorities, and that is very bad. What would you like to say about these, the niceties or the modalities of such a meeting to take place in the first place, where Pakistan allowed it on humanitarian grounds, and now we're also being accused of mistreatment? How do we wrap our minds around this double speak, sir?
Well, this is quite expected.
It's a typical reaction.
Yes, it is a typical reaction. You see, there are 2 aspects to it. India and Pakistan are 2 enemy countries, hostile. And then we have this serving commander of Indian Navy who gets caught red-handed and who confesses to heinous acts of terror, resulting in deaths of several Pakistanis and loss of millions of dollars of worth of equipment and property. And he admits to all this. And in creation of several terrorist cells and activities and programs to undertake terrorist activities. Now it is a very serious embarrassment for the Indian government to have such a person arrested in Pakistan who is a serving mid-ranking officer of the Indian Navy. Now just to reduce their embarrassment and of course continue to demonstrate their ill will against Pakistan, they would try and reduce the gravity of the situation by first of all denying that first of all we don't know who is this kulbushan, and then saying okay, he's a retired officer who was doing a private business, minding his own business, he's been apprehended and smuggled into Pakistan and then being shown as a terrorist, and that all that confession that he has made was under coercion. Now when we come to the meeting of the family with this officer, he is a very sensitive criminal, a very high value criminal, and it is an established international practice that whenever a meeting of such a criminal is to be taken place with anyone, especially his family, it has to be behind a glass door or behind a glass wall. It happens everywhere, even in India, that whenever such serious criminals are made to meet their family, it is behind a glass wall. And then of course him being a very serious criminal, we see that for security reasons, especially in the USA, you find people remove their belts, they remove their shoes, and
they'd strip them down to their underwear as far as they're concerned.
So here of course when these two ladies were scanned, it was found that of course one pair of shoes was having some metallic object, so it has to be removed. And similarly their cross or whatever religious article they were wearing on their person, they were removed.
Now, and they were returned as well.
And they were returned as well. You see, Indian intelligence agency would be quite inefficient, quite naive if they did not plant any such sensor on their person. It was to be taken for granted. So if a meeting is happening in such an environment, in such a backdrop, so all this had to happen. This was expected.
So don't you think that this entire situation, which is being blown out of proportion by the Indian media especially, doesn't it speak volumes about what the Indian intentions are? Khurram, I'll bring this question to you. Don't you think that the Indians never intended to acknowledge or appreciate or reciprocate this gesture by Pakistan, which was on purely humanitarian grounds, and they're now blowing it out of proportion and trying to make Pakistan look bad for doing the right thing or doing a good thing? How do we see this?
Waqas, such goodwill gestures by Pakistan have never been reciprocated from the Indian side. Be it's the denuclearization of Indian Ocean, be it's not allowing non-state actors to basically jeopardize the bilateral relations. India has basically never acted like a major or big country in the region. As far as Yadav is concerned, this is not for the first time that a serving officer of Indian armed forces have been found involved in acts of terrorism in Pakistan. In 2008, Colonel Prohit, who was a serving colonel in the Indian Army, he was involved in killing 60 Pakistanis on Indian territory in Samjhauta train blast.
Absolutely.
At that time, Indians placed the blame on Lashkar-e-Taiba, but later Indian investigators themselves, they basically found out that it was not Lashkar-e-Taiba, but Abhinav Bharat, a Hindu terrorist organization led by a serving army officer of India who was involved in that attack. So India has a long history of sponsoring terrorism in Pakistan. As far as yesterday's incident is concerned, that was purely based on a goodwill gesture. It was the 142nd birth anniversary of the founder of Pakistan. To basically commemorate that day, we have offered this to India. First, the Indians exercised a complete blackout of that meeting. Till late last night, there was no report in Indian media showcasing this meeting between Yadav and his family. And the next day, when Indian Foreign Ministry spoke up, they picked up all the negative things basically to discredit Pakistan. And reciprocity is something else, but they have rather discredited Pakistan, tried to discredit Pakistan's goodwill gesture. Why India has not reciprocated? I'm not very optimistic when it comes to the bilateral relations between India and Pakistan, because at the moment BJP is at the helm of affairs in India. It's the same party which has repeatedly manipulated anti-Pakistan sentiment in its electoral campaign. Not just in 2013, but in the recent election campaign in Gujarat.
That's right.
Modi accused the Congress member for having links with ISI. So Modi continues to sell anti-Indian sentiments, anti-Pakistan sentiment.
It seems to work.
Anti-Pakistan sentiment seems to be working to ensure his survival as the Prime Minister of India. So Modi is highly unlikely to give up this card.
Very, very sad. But on a personal note, I would like to also bring another aspect to this entire meeting on the record, and that is it's unfortunate that some journalists were found hectoring or trying to harass these guests who had come to meet their loved one, though he is a terrorist. What would you like to say about that, sir? The way certain, not everybody, but a few journalists were, which is also one of the things that the Indians have raised, that journalists had behaved very badly with the wife and mother of Yadav, calling her the relatives of a killer and whatnot, which is true, but I still think that it shouldn't have been said.
You see, there are two things to it. Firstly, when you look at the history of the Indians who have been visiting Pakistan, be they authors, be they artists, be they poets, anybody, they've had fantastic memories when they go back.
Absolutely.
We have been very good hosts to all such visitors from India.
Absolutely, sir.
And it is covered very well in the Indian media as and when these people go back. So we have a history of extending fantastic hospitality to all visitors from India. And here is a case where again we had invited them, they were here on our invitation, and basically as a goodwill gesture and on humanitarian grounds. Though they are visiting a person and they are the close relations of a person who has been involved and who has confessed to several heinous terrorist acts. Now, that is something which cannot be hidden, cannot be put under the blanket, cannot be ignored, and will always be in the mind of all those people who are standing there looking forward to speaking to them or getting their views, while the Foreign Office, the government of Pakistan made special arrangements to keep the press away from these visitors. And while we must not be supportive, we must be critical of any such behavior on part of Pakistani journalists, but then it is understandable, because the sentiments, the emotions are high, they are charged, because on seeing somebody who is closely related to a terrorist, though terrorist is not accessible, not visible, he is behind closed doors, he is in custody. So what they see is only his wife, only his mother. So it's only understandable that people would express their sentiments,
though regrettable.
Which is regrettable, and we should not appreciate that. It should not have happened, and the government of Pakistan did make arrangements that they do not come close to the visiting the Indian personalities, and of course it is regrettable if any such thing has happened.
Well, one of the claims made by the Indian government was that they felt intimidated as a result of whatever happened in Pakistan. But while the mother and the wife of Mr. Yadav was leaving, and Mr. Yadav himself has also repeatedly thanked the government for the treatment that the Pakistani government has meted out to them despite their criminal activities and terrorist activities. So wouldn't that also be understood by the Indian citizens, rather? The people of India should also be looking at those aspects and not just believing everything that their government tells them. And if you really look at the internal affairs of India, I don't think it's a very settled place right now. There are a number of insurgencies that are going on in India, not to mention just Kashmir, but even in other parts of India, people are not generally happy with the way things are.
Because it was a great opportunity to thaw the relations between the two sides, the strained relations. But unfortunately, India has lost this opportunity. After the yesterday's meeting, we were expecting in Pakistan that it will be reciprocated from the Indian side. I'm not sure what is intimidating in allowing the family to meet Yadav. But it certainly clarifies some misperceptions in Pakistan, or not misperceptions, rather wishful thinking that we sometimes attach to the Indian behavior with regards to Pakistan.
Right, and moving on about this shoe controversy, sir, I still need to get to the bottom of the shoe issue because that was something that was glaringly obvious. When the lady walked in, she was wearing a different pair of shoes, and when she walked out, they were different. And of course, it raises questions because everything else was returned to the lady other than the shoes. So what do you think, sir, what possible reasons could you attribute towards the government acting on that particular item of clothing?
You see, primarily someone from the intelligence agency would be able to throw better light on it. But the fact remains that if the shoe has not been returned, it has been retained, probably in the available time our intelligence agencies were not able to decipher or decode whatever is inside the shoe and whatever it was meant for. And they're still working at it. I'm sure they'll find it in a day or two, and then I guess the shoe would be returned minus the whatever metallic object or it was in the shoe.
A microchip.
Possibly.
We'll leave it at that, sir. Khurram, moving on. When these kind of exchanges take place, when terrorists such as Mr. Yadav is being allowed to meet with his family, we also had a statement coming out from the Foreign Office saying that this might not just be the last meeting and that there might be other meetings. So what do you basically derive from this particular statement of the Foreign Office?
There were speculations in India and Pakistan both that he has been given a death sentence by a military court in Pakistan. So this might serve as the last and final meeting between Yadav and his family. But we must not forget that his case is still being trialed in the International Court of Justice. So until that is resolved, we may not term it as the final meeting, although Pakistan is very hopeful about the outcome in its own favor, because we believe that our case is pretty strong against Yadav. Although India has tried to basically convey to the world that Yadav was in Iran for a private business, but if he was in Iran for a private business, why he was carrying a fake passport under the name of Hossein Mubarak Patel? So that's a major question, a technical point that India may not be able to defend in International Court of Justice. Secondly, Yadav was not a sole operative. Rather, it was a big network of operatives which worked for the Indian intelligence agency to wreak havoc in Pakistan, to conduct acts of terrorism. After Yadav's disclosures, almost dozens of arrests were made from different parts of Pakistan of those individuals who were basically
There was a proper terrorist cell that was dismantled.
It was a big terrorist network, not a cell, that was dismantled after his arrest.
Absolutely. Now, having all this evidence, why did Pakistan still feel the need to appear in the International Court of Justice? This is Pakistan's internal matter. When they catch a spy operating in Pakistani territory, why do they need to actually even listen to what the International Court of Justice is? Is it not Pakistan's prerogative to catch a spy operating in their own territory? What examples do we have of such cases existing during the Cold War between the Russians and the Americans? Wherever they caught any spies, they did not take them to the International Court of Justice.
It was not Pakistan, it was India which took the matter to the International Court of Justice. Matters actually pertaining to the national security of any country cannot be taken to the ICJ, but I would say a number of Pakistani legal experts are of the view that India has set a precedent which will later work in favor of Pakistan. In International Court of Justice, even if there's a decision which is not in favor of Pakistan, ICJ's decisions are not binding. In number of cases during Cold War, ICJs gave decisions which were not in favor of United States of America.
And they were never implemented.
And they were never implemented. So Pakistan is not legally binded to basically follow the International Court of Justice verdict. But if the verdict is in Pakistan's favor, it will bring us a lot of goodwill internationally, and it will reinforce Pakistan's narrative internationally.
Well, moving on, they also claim that that the 4 violations that were made by the Pakistanis while by allowing the mother and wife of Mr. Yadav to meet Mr. Yadav, that is more important than the very act of kindness that the Pakistani government actually showed, sir. Can we talk about this aspect, whether those 4 tidy violations, which really don't mean much in the grand scheme of things, are more important than the very gesture itself?
Okay, before I answer that, let me add. Kulbushan Yadav was not carrying a fake passport. He was carrying a genuine passport with a fake name.
Issued by the
Indian proper
government.
Indian passport authority. And he had traveled at least 16, 17 times into India and out of India on that passport.
But so the Indians have also, sir, previously, they denied any knowledge of Mr. Yadav, and then they eventually accepted it, and then they said that we're going to bring him back and whatnot.
Yes.
So
that one, and secondly, there was one case where a South American country national was being tried in the US, and he was to be sentenced, and his case was being tried in the International Court of Justice by that country. And while the case was on, they just executed him.
that's right.
So it depends who are the 2 parties. So if it is the USA, then they can afford to ignore.
Some
the
are more
ICJ
equal than others.
altogether. Now coming to these 4 violations. Now these are the 4 violations which the Indians claim these are the violations of the understanding between India and Pakistan. Now this understanding, although it's a very gentlemanly sort of an understanding between the 2 countries, it was never formalized, never documented, never signed as an agreement.
And it is also not to be considered as consular access, which also the Indians are now claiming that consular access was given. But then they also go on to further say that their consul was not allowed to meet Mr. Yadav, or not even allowed to witness the meeting that took place between Mr. Yadav and his family members.
You see, so it is the Indian version that these are the 4 violations of the understanding. Now what was the understanding? Was the understanding did actually exist in the manner that the Indians are claiming, and hence and that it has been violated? Pakistan never offered any consular or agreed to any consular access, and that case is right now in the ICJ.
Well, let's hope, sir, whatever the ICJ in its wisdom decides is based on justice and nothing else, because it is a court of law and not a court of justice, as they say. Well, thank you very much for taking out the time and, sir, sharing your views with PTV World. Well, in conclusion, we also would like to mention that today is the day that we lost one of the most iconic and dynamic leaders this country is, in fact, in the world has ever seen, and that is Mohtarma Benazir Bhutto. And there's not much we can say except that every Pakistani feels sad and every Pakistani misses Benazir Bhutto. And if she was alive today, maybe the political situation of the country may have been in a better state. Well, on that note, it's goodbye.